My name is Ilan Goldenberg. I run the Middle East program here at CNAS. And what we thought we would do with you guys today is basically walk through a scenario, a couple of different scenarios. It's not really a war game. It's more of a peace game and a war game, some diplomacy games. So it won't be exactly what you just experienced in the other session. But basically, about a few weeks ago, we brought together a group of experts from the United States, China, Russia, Europe, Israel, the Gulf. We also had a team of Iran experts to play a number of different scenarios about the future of Iran's nuclear programs, potential conflicts. And what we thought we'd do with you today is walk through some of those scenarios, get you guys to play a little bit, and also have a panel of experts here who were part of here all at CNAS, who were part of this exercise, to walk you through at least what happened when we played this ad over the span of a couple of days. And so what we're going to do is, first of all, make sure you've got the app, right? And you're in our session, interactive tabletop exercise on the future of Iran's nuclear program. Now, we're going to divide you into 3 teams. Tables 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You are Team USA. Okay? So you only vote, there will be polling, you only vote for the questions for United States, okay? Do not vote for the other 2 teams. You only vote for your questions. No sabotage here, okay? All right? I know this is especially true for Team Iran. Tables 6, 7, and 8. You are Team Iran. So again, you only vote for Iran. And tables 9, 10, 11, 12, you guys are Team Israel and the Gulf. So you're playing the regional players. All right, and so what we'll do is I'll walk through the scenarios, then we'll have a question for each of the teams, and then we'll give you guys a chance to vote. We'll see what the answers are, and then we'll turn it over to our panelists to talk about their experiences. Maybe we'll even mix in some commentary on current events. There's nothing going on with Iran right now in the last 24 hours, so we'll get to that as well. Before I do that, I'm just going to do a quick introduction of my colleagues. We have Liz Rosenberg, who I'm sure you all know, who runs our Energy, Economics, and Security program here at CNAS, and is one of the town's top experts on sanctions, economy, all things, and she and I work a lot on Iran together. Eric Brewer, who is, I got to get your title right now, because Eric was at CNAS until about a week or 2 ago, but has now just started at CSIS, where he's a deputy director and fellow with the project on nuclear issues at CSIS. So, perfect. And really good expert on nuclear issues. I'm glad I got that right. And Nick Heras, who is a fellow here at CNAS in our Middle East security program, has been a longtime colleague of mine. So let's get started. Scenario 1. So this scenario is supposed to take place on September 2021, but after yesterday's events, we might just call it Tuesday. Iran has suffered intense, so basically we're going 2 years into the future, all right? U.S. sanctions have driven Iranian oil sales down to about 200 to 300,000 barrels per day, 1/10 of what they were during the JCPOA. Iran in 2020 announced its withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, and has begun spinning centrifuges and now has enough low-enriched uranium for multiple nuclear weapons, if that uranium was enriched all the way back up to high-enriched uranium for nuclear weapons. So they don't have a nuclear weapon, they just are building up a lot of LEU. And it would take them 2 to 3 months from today, today being September 2021, if they chose to go for a nuclear weapon to get there. So to give you some context, that's roughly where they were in 2013 before the nuclear negotiations began. Right now, and where they've been with the JCPOA is a year away from a bomb. In November 2020, President Trump is reelected. And he maintains his maximum pressure strategy. At the same time, the regional situation kind of remains where it's been, which is tense. You have these occasional flare-ups, no major wars, nothing leads to conflict. Trump also continues to want to talk, which is something he's been doing in the press. He wants to engage with Iran. Thus far, that hasn't happened, at least in our scenario. Meanwhile, inside Iran, there's a lot of domestic pressure, but the regime remains in control despite the economic pressure. In June 2021, you have a presidential election that brings in a hardline candidate who ran on a policy that called for accelerating Iran's nuclear program and getting tougher in the region, but also made the point that only a man like him can negotiate with a man like Donald Trump, and that Hassan Rouhani, the current president, was too naive in the approach that he took. In July 2021, 3 Saudi Aramco Supermax oil tankers transiting the Straits of Hormuz are attacked and leak crude oil into the waterway. All tanker traffic slows for a period of 2 weeks, causing an immediate spike in prices and the cost of oil. In mid-August 2021, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu goes on national television to reveal that Israel has evidence that Iran is building a secret enrichment facility. He shares that all of the intel that Israel has had, it's now sharing with the United States and the International Atomic Energy Agency. He says that the facility is built deep into a mountain. It's probably got enough space for 3,000 centrifuges. It's unclear if any centrifuges have been installed yet, which basically gives you a sense that the facility is pretty well developed, but it's not going imminently into use. Iran denies the accusation. Iran's foreign minister denies the accusation. The IAEA reports after a couple of weeks that it's evaluated the information, finds it credible, and asks for access from the facility, which Iran denies. Then, a week later, in early September, CENTCOM releases a press statement indicating that that 6 American military and diplomatic officials have been killed in Iraq. The next day, there's a New York Times story saying that U.S. intelligence officials have high confidence that this was conducted by Kitab Hezbollah, an Iranian or sort of a Shia proxy group that's with very close ties to Iran, and that Iran essentially ordered this attack. It is now September 13th, a few days after the attack. 2 weeks have passed since the IAEA's first request for access, and Iran has still not allowed them into the facility. And so now, just to summarize, before you have to choose, basically we've had conflict in the Persian Gulf and in the Straits. We have Americans dead in Iraq. We have a potentially secret nuclear facility that is unclear precisely how far along the way it is. So now let's move on. So Team USA, your options. 1, basically take no further military action and look for a quiet dialogue and a back channel with Iran. 2, start with some limited operations, such special operations against Iranian proxies in Syria or Iraq, interdicting Iranian ships, nothing on Iranian territory. And at the same time, also look for a quiet back channel dialogue with Iran. 3, limited symbolic airstrikes against military infrastructure inside of Iran, along with against things like missile silos, mining storage facilities, things like that, and even at maybe training camps for some of Iran's proxies. And even as you're conducting that, at the same time, look for a back channel with Iran. Or 4 is more, I think, stepped up military actions against Iran to really degrade a series of Iran's capabilities. So for Team Iran, your choices. Again, 1 is no further military action. Look to start a quiet diplomatic channel with the United States. 2 is use proxies and cyber to escalate. Keep doing the types of things you've been doing, basically, the things we already have in the scenario. But at the same time, look for a quiet channel to de-escalate. 3 is do all of that, but at the same time also start laying mines in the Strait of Hormuz and basically closing the strait or taking a harder line in terms of going after American targets. Or 4 is, but even as you're taking that harder line, also keeping a channel of dialogue with the United States or looking for a channel to de-escalate. And 4 is forget the dialogue channel, just continue with all these military steps and continue to escalate. So Now everybody's got their apps. Everybody's got their phone. If you haven't already, take a moment and vote for, and again, only vote for your team. So, right, you got 3 options there. So just click on the one that, Is this working? Yeah. Is it clear? All right, so I'm going to give you guys a few more seconds to vote. Let's see. Everybody want to start voting? Team USA? All right, everybody, yeah, but don't wait until you see, all right, like the one key thing here is just vote. Don't look at the results for anybody else's team yet. We got to see those all simultaneously. That's kind of the point, right? All right, so let's see. So Team USA, can we also scroll down a little bit just to see what the last, okay. So nobody goes for the aggressive option, but there's some kind of a mix with a pretty heavy lean towards taking actions against Iran, but not inside of Iran itself to try to counter its activities. All right, let's look at Team Iran. Okay, wow, almost entirely split between, everybody's looking for a back channel, but at the same time, we also have a combination of how high up the escalation channel ladder you want to go. And did I go through the Israel and the Gulf scenario? Oh, I'm sorry about that, guys. That was my fault. All right. But you guys voted. All right, so let me explain the Israel-Gulf scenario. The Israel, it's either publicly call for the U.S. to prepare for war with Iran and sort of use a public diplomatic pressure campaign. 2 is do that, but also covert actions, including assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists, sabotage of nuclear facilities. Or 3 is do the first 2, but also conduct some unilateral airstrikes. So looks like we've ended up, interestingly, and everybody has gone towards the middle, right? In terms of various escalation scenarios. The U.S. going for the middle pathway of just going after Iran, but not inside of Iran. The Iranians looking to escalate, but also for a back channel, and the Israelis and the Gulf states looking to stir things up. So that sounds kind of about right in terms of where we are, short of all-out conflict, but definitely in the middle of a tit-for-tat dynamic. So maybe with that, I'll sit down and ask some of our colleagues sort of, what you took out of the game. Maybe Liz, I'll start with you, and get your impression both first on how the audience responded, and also really your assessment of like what the American team saw as we played this game out over the span of a day.
Sure, thank you. So I'll talk to the U.S. team from when we did this, and also to you all based on your responses here. And one of my first takeaways is that there's some parallelism in what happened. So congratulations, you are all U.S. experts. But to take this more seriously here, I think excuse me, one important takeaway. It's here. I got it. That I had in watching the way the U.S. team played out this escalation scenario, and the way you are, is that there's a clear interest across the board here, and maybe variations and slight iterations, but in general, an interest in responding and demonstrating that the United States won't be pushed around. There are certain responses, particularly that go to core U.S. interests, U.S. service people, or U.S. allies in the region, where the United States will not sit on its hands. There has to be a response here. And you were just saying tit for tat. So that can be part of the character of the U.S. response. And indeed, that's how you all reflected this too. And that's how we did. In more time with more moves in a game, there's a sort of response, a tit for a tat. And actually, one takeaway that I took from that experience was that can mean that in that movement forward, or if you will, a kind of escalation, it's actually very difficult it's easy to get stuck. It's hard to engage in successful negotiation and be able to crisis manage or de-escalate from there, because of this action-reaction cycle, the two sides have difficulty meeting each other and being able to find an accommodation or hit a pause or create constructive parameters for conversation. But nevertheless, there was then and now an instinct towards trying to manage the conflict. One other thing I'll say about looking at the rest of this ecosystem for this confrontation and from the U.S. perspective is that you can see that as things go, the action and reaction and the response, there's no real positive outcome for success against a number of U.S. objectives. So regional stability, nuclear security, staying really close on side with allies. In fact, actually, the situation is pretty tough on all of those fronts. We're just looking at an escalation and a real difficulty in being able to manage or pause or step back. And if we had the opportunity to let this play forward and have more of the crisis escalate, we might see movement towards some of those more aggressive options. And in fact, that's something we saw in the game that we played, was there was movement towards more escalation and the potential towards more aggressive options, although we had to stop that scenario that we played before it came to all-out war, for which there is no clear, immediate, direct interest on any side of getting engaged. Maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, Nick, maybe you spent the entire basically day with the Iran team when we did this. So how did you, what was the experience that you took out of that? How are the Iranians thinking about this situation?
Well, I think our scenario today played very similarly to what we observed. You know, Iran had a very clear objective, which is, in this scenario, it felt under siege and it was worried about regime survivability. And it felt that it had a weak hand, that it was isolated internationally, that it couldn't rely on sort of the other great powers, China, Russia, or Europe, to help relieve pressure from it. And therefore, in order to play its weak hand strongly, it had to use the cards available to it, which is managing the escalation ladder very carefully with the United States and rank ordering how it would respond. It would avoid responding to U.S. provocations unless they clearly had to respond. It would try its best to avoid provocations from Israel, ranking them as similar to the United States, but responding firmly if the Gulf escalated. And we saw that over the course of the game. At one point, the Gulf did escalate, and the Iranians responded with the means available to them, which was to utilize proxies to sort of maneuver and to send a signal to the Gulf that they can't act in that way. I mean, fundamentally, the objective was to play the weak hand strongly and to try to force a decision point within the United States, to test Trump, to put pressure on Trump in the scenario and say, do you really want a war with us? Do you really want a massive shock to the global economy if we decide to close the Strait of Hormuz? Do you want to push us so hard that we target U.S. service members? Do you want to push us that we might target Israel? And it was interesting that everything that the Iran team tried to do was to force that direct communication with the United States.
Yeah. And maybe, Nick, you can also chat a little bit about how did the Israelis in the Gulf in that scenario play out?
The Israelis were relatively restrained, and the Gulf, however, was much more aggressive. The Gulf believed that it had a sort of green light from the United States to escalate, and what resulted was you had a Saudi and Emirati series of airstrikes against Iranian oil installations. The Iranian team assessed that that was a direct threat and responded by supporting a movement by the Houthis into southwest Saudi Arabia. So in that conflict pattern, you had the destruction of Iranian oil installations, but you had the occupation of a chunk of southwest Saudi Arabia because of real-world dynamics, which is that the Houthis have effective fire control over large pieces of that area.
So, Eric, one thing that you and I talked a little bit about is that, you know, in this scenario, like, you're the nuclear guy, but the nuclear issue didn't really drive the scenario at all, which is like when we first designed the scenario, we really thought the secret nuclear facility was going to be the thing that triggered folks. But it really didn't. It became all about the regional dynamic. You sort of surprised about that? Because oftentimes we hear the opposite, that our policy is too focused on the nuclear and not enough on the regional.
Yeah, I don't think it was totally surprising, right? I mean, I think you know, Iran's regional activities, I think, are certainly. I think the nature of the game and the predominance and the focus of the players on those activities, I think, reflects how it would play out in reality as well. I mean, I think those sorts of provocations and those sorts of crises are going to be sort of staring the United States in the face, if you will, and they're going to require focus and they're going to require a response. I think the nuclear issue is much more of a slow boil, right? I mean, it's something that is there. I mean, it is certainly, at least since the JCPOA has been in effect, there's cushion built in there, right? I mean, the year-long breakout timeline that resulted from the changes that Iran made to its nuclear program under the deal, and the IAEA's access and a lot of the added transparency measures, I think, for the purposes of the game, that in this scenario, like Iran wasn't in the deal, but I think there was still like the IAEA was still there, and so there was still like a little bit of reassurance that nothing was moving too fast, too quickly. I also think too, in this scenario, we had the underground nuclear facility, but it wasn't clear whether it was actually enriching uranium. So I think folks thought that there was a little bit of, again, wiggle room there, a little bit more time to be patient, and so that allowed that issue to be put on the back burner. I would note, I think it's interesting in this game. We also had, and I don't think you talked about it in your intro remarks, but there was some intelligence leaks to the New York Times, and there was, from the U.S. intelligence side, basically substantiating this story. And none of the players in the game, I don't think, really questioned that intelligence. I think most of the U.S. partners accepted it, which I think is interesting when you look at some of the dynamics that are playing out today, with there being some reluctance to accept some of the assertions that the U.S. government is making about Iranian activities in the region. So I think that's an interesting dynamic. And in terms of like the other players and how some of this played out, I would echo Nick's comments on Israel and the Gulf. That I think it's interesting that there were no U.S. partners in the region that were encouraging restraint, right? I mean, if anything, they're encouraging the U.S. to do more. There was a bit of a fear that actually the U.S. might cut a separate deal, might try and de-escalate and cut a separate deal as part of this process. But there were a few actors trying to restrain the United States. And we also saw, as Nick mentioned, some of these actors, if I recall correctly, I think it was Israel and Saudi Arabia, that initiated some covert and some overt actions against Iran's nuclear facilities and oil facilities. And Iran viewed that as actually an effort done jointly with the United States. And so that also added another layer of complexity and complication in terms of developing some of these off-ramps for de-escalation, and just sort of really muddied the picture as we went through.
Yeah, although I will say, we don't have it today, but we did have it in the game. We also had a Team Russia, a Team China, and a Team Europe. Like, those were the players who were playing the most in terms of trying to restrain. And it was actually interesting to think about transatlantic relations. The Europeans very much found themselves together with the Russians and the Chinese, which is not necessarily where we want them as the United States. But I think that they also expressed frustration at how little influence they had in this scenario in terms of actually being able to control anything. And the other thing I'll just say, and maybe this is also a question back to you guys, which is one of the things I found in the way you're describing it, and also the way everybody here played it in the room, right? Both sides are looking to, all right, I'm going to just hit them one more time to let them know I mean it, and then I'm going to sue for talks, and we'll de-escalate. And so you'd have the American team would hit them one more time at this low level, just like you guys did, and then engage, right? I think the American team's over here. And then as the American team is developing their engagement plan, well, here's the Iranian team, and they're like, well, we just got hit, so we need to hit them one more time, and then we'll engage. And so then that goes back to the American team. And so you end up in this cycle where both sides are kind of trying to de-escalate, but instead they're escalating. And meanwhile, the Israelis and the Gulf states are sitting on the side, basically encouraging and sort of, because of their own fear of, being abandoned or ending up sort of outside of this. I will say, guys, what do you think, and maybe before we move on, hard not to, we drew all this up before we had a major incident yesterday in the Gulf. How do you think what we learned in the game, what does that mean for what we just saw in the Gulf? And more broadly, what do you think of what happened yesterday?
Well, that is one of the first things that I thought about when I saw the news, is that, this feels eerily familiar. We actually just played this game, and here is reality. And we're making a few assumptions here, which is to say we are assuming that, in fact, the attribution for the attack attacks belongs to Iran. So that's what, just to be clear, though that is at present disputed in the press, et cetera, and by this Japanese shipping company. So it did feel like realistic to think, well, we do see some, let's just assume there's a kind of tit for a tat and an action and a reaction, and it's very easy for there to be an inadvertent miscalculation, because while there is an instinct on both sides towards management and certainly avoiding all-out war, but a willingness to engage in a response and a pushback, in fact, that has some, that may be violent and that may have true consequences for the other side. There's an enormous potential to get stuck in an escalating cycle and have no real meaningful opportunity for off-ramp there. So the takeaway for me, thinking about the state of U.S. politics on this issue and the potential that the true avenues of potential avenues for policy, is that we may not be imminently near war. We're not imminently near war, but there is a tremendous scope for inadvertent and difficult to manage escalation and miscalculation, and that is fearsome because it will have true material impacts for potentially directly for U.S. interests, for U.S. allies, for oil markets, or otherwise trade flows.
I would say the parallel with the game is that the Iranian perspective is that the 12 points have been put forward by the U.S. is essentially a surrender document when you talk about removing your proxy support, your strategic deterrence against your adversaries, and potentially never being able to have a nuclear program. So the Iranian team, as I'd imagine echoes real life, is trying to reset the terms of what is the opening step in this negotiation. And so much of what they did in escalation was messaging. And the symbolism behind that, and to echo the points that have been made, is that when you get in this pattern of conflict and other actors in the region are also involved, it can spiral out of control.
Eric, do you want to?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with the broad suggestion that we've got to be concerned about miscalculation, but I think we also have to recognize that it's not just like all of this would be a big giant accident, right? I think what the actors are doing, both Iran in real life and in the case of the scenario, is calculated risk-taking, right? I mean, they're undertaking these actions knowing that there is a risk of a response, right, from the United States or from other countries. But they feel compelled to do them to either show resolve or to hit back, to show that they're not going to sit back idly while they're being pressured. They are executing them knowing that there is that risk. I think the hope on both sides is that they're going to do so in a way that's a tit for tat, that's reciprocal, right? They want to hit back in a way that is on the sort of the same level and same playing field. The question becomes, though, is there a shared common definition of what that is? And I'm not sure that necessarily holds moving forward.
That's a depressing point. And I'll throw in my own 2 cents before we move on to scenario 2, just on what happened yesterday, which is just to say, at least in my assessment, I agree we need to wait and see what the intelligence bears out, but it seems extraordinarily likely that this was Iran. It's hard for me to imagine this being a false flag, somebody else, because it's just nobody's good enough to pull this off, in a way that would be so effective. And the Iranians have been threatening this kind of thing. It's very much their MO. It's not at all surprising. But I will tell you, I think yesterday may have been a fundamental shift, like a real fundamental shift, in that if you'd asked me 2 days ago, I would have told you the likelihood of war between the U.S. and Iran is very low, and a lot of the noise we're seeing in the press is just that noise. After yesterday, I'm much less sure, because for these tankers to be hit, and for it to happen while the Japanese prime minister is in Tehran, the first Japanese prime minister visit in 40 years, basically very embarrassing to him. And then for the supreme leader to come out with a series of tweets at the same time, essentially, dismissing this diplomatic effort, that does not feel to me like something that the more pragmatic elements inside of Tehran, like Hassan Rouhani or Javad Zarif, would be advocating for. That feels like harder line elements inside of Iran. And for the last year, what you've seen is a pretty restrained Iranian response to what the U.S. pressure strategy, to the Trump administration's maximum pressure strategy. It's really been an approach of, we're going to not provoke a conflict. We're going to try to isolate the United States from its partners. We're going to play this slow. And even last month, when Iran announced that it might, over 60 days, start to marginally violate the nuclear deal, it was still a sort of slow game. But that's not what we saw yesterday. We saw yesterday something that was pretty bold and pretty surprising, and very different than anything we've seen, I think, in the last year. And so that makes me worried, because if that's where we're going, we might have actors on both sides who don't know how to put the brakes on. So anyway, with that happy note, and we can get more into that in Q&A, why don't we walk through the second scenario, which is a more optimistic scenario. It's March 2021, so we're actually not going as far into the future. Or maybe if the first scenario was Tuesday, then March 21 is a year and a half into the future. Iran did withdraw from the JCPOA in 2020. It's reconstituted its nuclear program. It's got enough low-enriched uranium in this scenario, for a number of weapons, but it would take it 6 months if tomorrow it were to decide to go for it. So not as bad as we are in the first scenario. Iran's, the rejection of the JCPOA was a central tenet in the politics of parliamentary elections in 2020 in Iran, which brought in a more hardline parliament. And we're now in March 2021, so we have in a few months an Iranian presidential election. It's unclear how that is necessarily going to go. In November 2020, the United States elects Kamala, Biden, Buttigieg, Sanders, Warren, O'Rourke as its next president. Congress remains split with a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. During the primaries, the president announced that her foreign policy would include returning to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. But during the general election, she pivoted a little bit, added some caveats and suggestion that maybe there would also be a need for a follow-on agreement to address some of the shortcomings of the nuclear deal, to extend some of the sunsets on the nuclear provisions, and start also dealing with some of the disagreements we have with Iran on various regional issues. Commentary in the Arab press during the election was incredibly critical of the Democratic side of this new president. And Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's still in office, has been a vocal opponent of her position, and called it a potentially catastrophic mistake. Meanwhile, the Supreme Leader has expressed skepticism of the administration's so-called new approach, saying that sweet words with no action would not sway Iran. This is, we'll see. Well, her being this combined candidate. We'll see. Her, yes, president, well, anyway. It's a long name. But on her second day in office, the president orders a 60-day review of her Iran policy, but does not take any steps to go back into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It's now mid-March. We're coming to the end of that review, and the American team is ready to move out on a strategy. So here are the options. For the U.S. team, you have 4 options, Team USA. 1 is to announce you're going back into the JCPOA immediately, without any preconditions. 2 is to engage with other members of the P5+1 and Iran on the U.S. going back into the JCPOA, but also as part of that, at least insist on beginning to outline the scope of broader negotiations on some of the issues that we still disagree on. A third option is to do something much more limited, basically a freeze for freeze, or return to the JPOA, if folks are familiar with that, which is basically the initial agreement that just everybody agrees to sort of stop doing a couple things that are problematic on the sanctions side and on the nuclear side, and then go back into negotiations, but without returning to the JCPOA. Or 4 is to say we're not going back in and instead lay out parameters for a much broader big for big deal that addresses all the different issues and try to start the negotiations that way. Now, Team Tehran, your choices. You can immediately agree to re-enter the JCPOA and come back into compliance. You can insist that as part of re-entry into the JCPOA, the United States also, basically give Iran compensation for the fact that Iran stuck with the deal for so long, and it was the United States that violated it. So you want the JCPOA plus you want more economic concessions. 3 is also to seek sort of a short-term freeze-for-freeze agreement, like the one that we described from the US side. Or 4 is to say, look, we have presidential elections coming in 2 months, and we're just going to have to deal with this afterwards because there's really nothing we can do right now. Now, third scenario, for the third team, for the Israel and the Gulf. One is you can seek a dialogue with the US and the new US administration to try to come to a common understanding of what a new deal could look like and how you want to coordinate your regional and nuclear policies and ballistic missiles. 2 is to coordinate an active political public campaign to pressure the administration for a comprehensive deal, to go to Congress to try to pass legislation, for example, that sets a very high bar for any new deal, or for even re-entry into the deal. Or 3 is to conduct covert attacks against Iran's nuclear program without consulting with the United States. So why don't we all take a moment to vote? Again, only vote for your team. No sabotage. Actually, that applies both to Iran and to Israel. And let's see where we go. All right. So Team USA. Go back up. Huh.
Wow.
Pretty. Whoa. Whoa. All right. We're going to give it a couple more seconds, and then we'll go. All right. Why don't we go? It looks like, right, let's scan back up also. It's pretty even division here, 13, 25, 25, 38. But it seems like the least popular is to just go back into the JCPOA with no preconditions, which is kind of interesting because that's the position of Democratic candidates right now. The most popular is to not re-enter the JCPOA and just start from scratch, which, might sound great, but is also like really complicated, and like that's a years-long negotiation. So good luck with that one. And then you also have, these other options in the middle. Okay. Let's see what Team Tehran go ahead for. There we go. Insist as part of re-entry that you receive compensation for the years of American violations of the deal, which, preview, that's exactly what happened in our game. But yeah, with pretty much everything else. And again, the least popular being going back into the JCPOA. All right, and how about Israel and the Gulf? All right, very much towards basically a repeat of the play of 2015 on the Israeli side of going for, and to a lesser extent from the Gulf of applying pressure to try to limit the administration's choices. Well, that's, I'll tell you one thing, like before we start with questions. That's not all that different than what happened in the game. The one thing that was definitely interesting and kind of disturbing as somebody who supported the JCPOA is how hard and complicated it became very quickly with all these different factors and choices to like go back in. Much more complicated, frankly, than most of the players had expected. I think you're sort of seeing that by the way people voted here too. But Liz, why don't I turn it over to you, maybe to give us your assessment, sort of what the U.S. team was facing in this scenario and your impressions of the scenario.
Sure. So seems a little okay. What Ilan said is true, is that there is some parallelism from what the U.S. team here did in the game that we played. However, if I may characterize, you all are a bit more hawkish than the team in our scenario, and we certainly stacked the U.S. team in our scenario with hawks who never supported the JCPOA, as well as people who did and helped to work on it. So I would not say that our group, not knowing all of you and your particular perspectives on this, I would not say that the group that we put together was biased one way or the other. But nevertheless, your reaction is a little bit more hawkish. And perhaps that's informed by the politics that have played out over the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks that in the interim between when we did the scenario or not. But anyway, let me move on to make a couple of points based on what Ilan started out saying. So why was this so difficult? And which is actually really important to unpack, given that, as you said, the Democratic candidates, so it's okay that you've amalgamated them in this hypothetical scenario to mush them all together, because in fact, many of them hold the position of let's go back into the JCPOA. So looking at the reality of that, what it comes down to is, notwithstanding smart people, creative people who know the history and the legal authorities and the counterparties here very well, it's really difficult to consider going back in and to try and execute against that. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and I'll just really quickly indicate. One is timing. So recall in this scenario that we have the new U.S. administration coming in. It takes them some time to get all of the appointed officials through their hearings and sworn in their posts, and they've met their staff. And this Iran policy review, it takes some time to happen. So they're just starting to put together and build the kind of coalition. They've obviously got domestic work to do with the Congress, so getting to know each other and building their strategy to try and move out on that. So that takes time. Simultaneously, Iran is headed toward its own election. So the U.S. has put together its strategy, but it doesn't know which Iranian who from Iran will be on the other side of be its counterpart in only a couple months' time. So it's hard to establish firm commitments that you have confidence in that they will last. So that has meant it meant in the scenario that there was still a willingness to try and give, but in fact it had to be we do the whole thing now, because we don't have confidence that we can do a little or kick it all down the road for a longer process. There's sort of an interest in going really big for big at the outset, but difficulty in the timing. In addition to that, the regional restraints. So Israel and the Gulf were not to be left out of this situation. Their interests were not to be sidelined, and they needed desperately so now I'm just sort of jumping ahead to this, and you all have more to say, but the United States was in a position such that it would have to coordinate, which takes more time, which is an added constraint, to build coalition and common cause with these regional allies. And if they don't, those allies have the opportunity to make mischief in U.S. domestic politics, which can break up the ability of the U.S. administration to do any of this. So, and by this I'm referring certainly to allies and counterparts in Israel and also in Gulf states too, in Saudi Arabia, et cetera. Finally, I will just say that the cool and difficult relationship with Russia is also a drag on this whole process. It had meant in our scenario that there was very little room for creativity and connectivity between the United States and with Russia. Russia was the party that really walked Iran through the door on a number of nuclear issues, and frankly, the only country in a position to offer the kind of civil nuclear connectivity that everyone could get okay with. So the poor relationship between Russia and the United States, which we have looked forward into this scenario as assuming a kind of steady state, is another big drag. So I'll stop there, but against that backdrop, this looks extremely difficult for the United States.
Nick, actually maybe I'll ask Eric this time to hop in first, and especially since you and I actually wrote an article about how the U.S. should go back into the JCPOA, but look for basically, we wrote an article advocating for the Team USA to choose option B. So we got about 25% support for that. So are you surprised?
That's not bad.
Yeah. Are you surprised at how the game played out? What did you think?
Yeah, I mean, like you, actually, let me actually start real quickly by picking up where Liz left off on Russia. I think that's an important point because during negotiations for the JCPOA, the US and Russia were pretty good, I think, at walling off a lot of the other issues that they had at the time to focus on the JCPOA. And if we can't count on that moving into whatever is next, I think that's problematic. But to your question, I mean, I think, it did surprise me how difficult it was. I think what's also hard is that I think all sides recognize, and no matter where you fall out on, do we get back, don't we, how, there's a recognition that just the JCPOA is not enough. Right? It's a starting point, perhaps. Maybe it's not even a starting point. Maybe you need to go bigger earlier on. But I think that makes it really complicated and complex quickly. So in addition to the comments that Liz made about why it's hard to go back, I think The other thing that made it difficult in this scenario is there was no JCPOA basically anymore, right? And there was nothing to build on, there was nothing to draw from, snapback had kicked in. And so I think there's perhaps a belief out there that's it's almost easier if you blow everything up and start afresh, but I think in this case, it actually made it more difficult. And I think we actually struggled to make that decision of whether or not we do go all in and the JCPOA and have snapback. So I think from the starting point of do we go back, it's going to matter a lot as whether there's something to go back into. The point that Iran is going to ask for compensation, again, I think those were echoed both here and in the game. I think there's a question, though, a big question over how much that desires for real compensation and how much of it's an optics issue and a politics issue. And so, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm naive in this, but I think there might be a way to work that out where there is some degree of compensation, even if you're doing perhaps a more for more type scenario at the outset. So I think that's a challenge, it's a problem, but I'm not sure it is totally insurmountable in terms of getting some sort of new negotiated agreement. The timing the difficulties were mentioned, the domestic politics in both countries were mentioned as a difficulty. And I would also say too, it's not like we're just sort of rerunning JCPOA negotiations as the next phase. Both sides have learned things from the old deal, right? And I think Iran, and Liz, you made this point, I think at a panel we did the other day on the Hill, that Iran knows that sanctions are about more than just a presidential waiver, right, at this point. And so that's going to be a much tougher conversation and a much tougher sell. I think we're also going to have to convince Iran that the next president is not going to just walk away from whatever deal we sign. I think the congressional sort of treaty ratification path is fraught with a lot of separate difficulties that could entertain a whole entire panel. But I think the other lesson we've learned is that we have to, the next US president, if they want to get back on the deal, will have to grapple with missile issues and regional issues in some way, shape, or form. There's a lot of flexibility, I think, in what that looks like, but I think that's the reality of the situation. And that's one thing that we did write about that I think still stands and is going to be true moving forward.
Nick.
So to echo my colleagues into what has transpired today, the Iranian team, viewed fundamentally the ball was on the American side of the pitch. And they had developed a resistance economy that restarted the nuclear program. In the initial phase of the scenario, there was a pretty intense internal debate within the Iran team. We had an actor that played Rouhani's Arif faction, we had an actor that plays for the supreme leader, another actor that plays for the IRGC hardliners. And what we found was there was an initial consensus in the Iran team to see what they could get from the new US administration. Their starting ask was the removal of the UN snapback sanctions and also some immediate relief for Iran on its economy, particularly winding back some of the non-oil related sanctions as sort of as a goodwill measure. When they didn't receive that, the more hardline factions fell back on a policy of, look, it's up to them. We will wait till after our presidential elections to re-engage. And then they also kind of came up with some more maximal type of endgame that they wanted to take from it. They wanted not only the oil to start flowing, but in Iranian banks to have access to the national economy. They also wanted a real mechanism from Europe, China, and Russia that would insulate Iran from future US actions under a different administration, which is a point that has been made. For them, fundamentally, this was about Iran's long-term national security interests. And they did. They wanted compensation. And fundamentally, what they wanted to do was to force the United States to come to them hand in hand and say, we want this agreement, and we want to make it, and we want to show that there's a different tact. And the consensus was nuclear only. No missiles, no regional issues. If you are serious with this deal, nuclear only, and you will give us insulation from any future activities.
So maybe I'll throw in my 2 points, or a few points, and we'll add it into questions. One is just to say that despite the fact that, you have all these Democratic candidates and the Democratic Party now at this point saying we should go back into the JCPOA, and I was somebody who supported the JCPOA. I actually think that's still, frankly, the right policy position in many ways, even though it's probably not workable, because really what it is shorthand for we need to re-engage in diplomacy the day after, if you have a different president. But I think people need to understand it in that way, not in though literally you're going to be able to go back in, because you may or you may not, and that's just really, really complicated and will depend on the time. The other thing is I was definitely one who, and we're going to be spending, by the way, for the next year at CNAS, we're going to be working on a project which looks at how the US does go back into the JCPOA, or what does a diplomatic approach look like if it doesn't, and how do you do something similar? And I would definitely much before this game was in the world of we should go in looking to go back in, and then also seeing how we can build on it. Now I almost feel like you need to almost have this be a three-phased process or a multi-phase process, where the first thing you do is just try to get to some kind of freeze for freeze, which is asks a lot less of the US and a lot less of Iran for starters. And then maybe eventually you can build back into the JCPOA and beyond it. One of the nice things about the JCPOA is it does have an annex which walks through all the different steps both parties need to take to go in the first place. So you could just update those for some kind of process over time. But I do think one of the other lessons we took is you need to do a lot more with our regional partners in the beginning, with Israel and the Gulf, and get that process going and have real conversations with them so we don't have a repeat of the ugliness of 2015, because it undercuts any sort of bipartisan support, any durability of the agreement. And so I think that's just another key thing for us to consider as we do this. But anyway, maybe what we'll do is stop there now and open it up for questions, both on the scenarios, on what's happened in the last couple of days with Iran, and on whatever folks would like to talk about. So, Dan, we have a question right in front. We have a microphone coming to you. And identify yourself.
Dan DeLuce with NBC News. Thanks for this. On the first scenario, when you played it, what happened when the U.S. took bombed or took military action against Iran directly? How did Iran respond, and did it start spiraling from there? And my question after that is, either in these scenarios or in the real world, is there a way for the U.S. to deter or to mitigate some kind of attacks on tankers or disruption of shipping in the Gulf?
So the Iranian responses to U.S. actions included laying some mines in the Strait of Hormuz, to which the U.S. responded with interdiction of Iranian ships. When that interdiction pattern occurred, one of the highest escalation that occurred was that the Iranians potentially green-lighted some of their proxy groups in Iraq to apprehend U.S. citizens that were there for business. And this was at the very end of the scenario. And interestingly, that did sort of lead to some momentum to try to have a back-channel communication. It wasn't fully formed by the end of the scenario, but it was interesting that in a sense, from the Iranian team's perspective there, as they were sitting in the last moments of that scenario, they felt vindicated in a way that they had met sort of U.S. action with their own action underneath a certain escalation level that got the Americans willing to talk, first about this discrete issue, and then potentially about other issues.
Nick, you were sitting with the Iran team. I was sitting with the control cell as we were doing this. As I remember it, the trigger, interestingly, and I'll admit, this was us playing a little bit with the game. Like, the reality was that it took a lot to get the sides to escalate. So there was this tit for tat going, but for them to go to all-out war, like, we as the control cell had to start jacking it up and encouraging them to do that, because we wanted to see how far would it take. And we really had them trying to play Trump and Bolton and Pompeo. We had people who were trying to do that realistically. So we engineered this a little bit. But what ultimately did it is the Saudi strike on Iranian oil facilities in response to the Iranians blowing up some Saudi things, which then led the Iranians to start dropping mines, which then there was the mines in the Strait of Hormuz, which triggered a much more massive American military response at that point. I mean, that was the red line for the U.S. when Iran started dropping mines into the Strait of Hormuz, like in an aggressive fashion. How do you prevent that in terms of today and deter that. I think it's, I don't like the way we're doing it right now, frankly. I think it's too loud. It's very brazen. I mean, I'm fine with like moving an aircraft carrier in, but sometimes these messages to the Iranians don't need to be sent all over the press. They need to be sent privately. We had, like when I was at the Pentagon in 2011 and 12, when we were working, we had a number of very tense moments with Iran. I was on the Iran desk, and we had a very tense moment in Iraq where they were, arming. Where we had weapons going in that we thought were a huge problem, and we sent some signals, including rolling some people up in Iraq, and we combined it with a quiet message through the best channels we had directly into Iran to say, knock it off, or you're about to get yourself into a huge fight. And I found that works a lot better than these very loud pronouncements, which force the Iranians then to save face by responding publicly. So this is what I don't like about this, John Bolton putting out this statement. I mean, I think moving the aircraft carrier and sending a quiet message that says exactly the same thing would have been much more effective in my mind.
Can I address this too?
Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to say, my observation from that experience, and perhaps this also is an observation about the way that we've written these scenarios for this game that we've all played today, is that the instincts that we saw and that we've sort of brought through this were a bit more along the lines of a playbook at a set of plays around response, and not an instinct or a playbook for a true disproportionate act that is meant to be a forceful deterrent. So if you think, we oftentimes people these days, including myself, use deterrence lots to mean lots of different things. And I think actually what we saw is the use of what we might, little d deterrence as a kind of like response or pushback, but not the kind of deterrence in perhaps a more classical sense where we're talking about a massive and disproportionate escalation in the hard security sphere as a serious pushback. And maybe that's because we haven't yet gotten anywhere close to the kind of serious escalation where we are looking at all-out conflict, but there's really not the methodology, the instinct, the play to get anywhere near that.
Question in the back.
Hi, Rob Levinson, Bloomberg Government. Talking about, potential scenario to get back into the JPOA, say, something happens in 2020, a new administration. I'm curious what you think in terms of things that have changed, given on the domestic side, and given the sort of divisions in the Democratic Party that are emerging, say, on Israel and support for Israel and policy of Israel, and, say, on the Trump administration's sort of total embrace of Netanyahu and sort of the more hard line on the Israeli side. Does that create an even more difficult partisan environment, whatever the next, I'm assuming it's a different president, wants to do that, would hamper or tie that president's hands if they wanted to reapproach the JCPOA?
You guys want to try it, or should I take it? Everybody's looking at me.
I can give the Iran piece of it after you.
All right. So I'll take the Israel piece. I think, well, first of all, I think there's a very reasonable chance that, in our scenario, we kept Netanyahu in office because it's just simpler than starting to conjecture about what might happen in Israeli politics. But given sort of the challenges that he is under right now, legally and with this election coming up, there's a reasonable chance he's not there in 2021. And I'll say, frankly, that a scenario of a new Democratic president and Netanyahu still in office in Israel is like a very tough one for the U.S.-Israel relationship. But so much of the tension is, there's things where there are fundamental disagreements and you have to work them out. But I think so much of it is based in personalities that if he's not there, then things are a lot easier and you can get over it. You know what I'm saying? Israel and the US have a long history of disagreeing on things and taking it behind closed doors and having serious strategic conversations about it. And you do that with your partners and friends. But if it's him, I think that he's so involved in the politics here that's what makes it impossible. And so and I do think that, and I worry that the Israeli instinct in that scenario will be, even as a new Democratic president is deliberating on what exactly to do, will be to jump right into scenario 2, which was option 2 for the Israel team, play it up big time, put on the intense political press. I think that would be a mistake. I think it would be much better for if there's a new Democratic president, for them to come in and be able to have a serious conversation with their Israeli partner about, okay, what do you want out of this, and what do we want out of this, and what are our bottom lines, and can we find a way to do this quietly or more effectively together, or at least prevent it from becoming another big explosion like in our relationship, like the one we saw in 2015. I just have a hard time seeing that happen with Netanyahu, frankly.
So the Iranian team actively thought about the regional element of it before even going into these negotiations, scenario 2. And their thought process was, if there's pressure on the American side of the new administration to have an agreement that includes regional issues, can that new administration politically walk back from the 12 points that Pompeo set out, particularly the regional issues? And this strikes at some very important dynamics for Iran. Not supporting groups in Afghanistan and Iraq, that's Iran's territorial integrity. Walking off its support in Syria, in Lebanon, again, that's Iran's strategic deterrence against Israel. The same potentially for its junior partner, the Houthis, in Yemen, strategic pressure against Saudi Arabia. And so there was a real dialogue within the Iranian team about the extent to which any type of engagement and discussion with the Americans on regional issues would just lead to the same maximal points being presented. I think that's going to be an interesting debate moving forward if there's a new administration from other parties. How much of those 12 points do you keep? And what can you trade away for other gains?
Other questions? We have one over here. And maybe I'll take 2 questions at once because we're starting to get near the end. So we have 2 right next to you.
This is really quick. In the prior game, which sounds fascinating, by the way, was there any discussion about waiting until after the elections on the part of the Iranian team, where you've got a politics that's so personal, so based on, the nuclear deal is not just a nuclear deal; it's got behind it a whole kind of policy direction.
So, and then there's a question.
The simple question is, did they consider the waiting until the election was over?
Did the Iran team consider waiting until their own election was over? Yeah, and the question right there.
Kevin Buckley, Energy Partners. Sort of two-part question about the things that could lock the JCP out from reinstatement in your second scenario. First is the Saudis. If there's enrichment happening in Iran, they've been pretty clear about wanting parallel capabilities to the game, or do you currently envision how that could factor into the dynamics? The second, institutional memory in Iran. You can't get very far into JCPOA history without thinking about the things that the current administration in Iran talked about, Mossadegh and Eurodiff, right? Betrayals that they haven't forgotten. To what extent is there a way to recover from the betrayal, or perceived betrayal of the president?
Okay, and do we have any? I'll see if there's any other questions, because I think what we'll do is do this as a lightning round. All right, we actually have 2 more questions. Let's take them both, and then we'll wrap.
Thanks. Jonathan Fang with Thomson Reuters Special Services. Just wanted to ask, did you figure in any autonomy within the proxy groups for Iran at all in the scenario, or were they just simply rubber stamping Iran's actions?
Okay, and one more question over here.
So as the U.S. team was considering some of these more escalatory options, was there talk about how this fits into the broader global U.S. posture? Because I feel like in the last year or so, there's been a bit of a turn in Washington against a heavy level of engagement in the Middle East. And so regardless of how these scenarios are playing out, if that's a strategic priority for an administration, wouldn't that be something that would affect how we respond in some of these situations?
So we got a series of questions. I think maybe we'll start with Nick, who can definitely do what the Iran team was thinking, as well as sort of the question on proxies. Eric, I'm sure you want to do the Saudi nuclear question. We had Iran history, which I think any one of you can answer. Maybe Liz, you can take sort of the U.S. global position in the world. So, Nick.
The Iranian team had a very active wait till after their elections. We'll call it the Rouhani Zarif players. felt that they could use their impending exit as a means to try to get concessions from the Americans up front, because of the possibility there'd be a far less amenable new president that would come into power who would make more demands on the Americans and maybe more intransigent. And so that's where the initial offer of, can you get snapback sanctions off? Can you offer us some immediate relief with some of these sanctions on our non-oil industry? That didn't happen. The leadership, we'll say more conservative hardline faction, said, no, we will wait. The ball is in the Americans' half of the pitch, and use that as an anchor. In terms of the negotiations with the Europeans and with the Chinese and with the Russians, it got somewhat emotional in the sense that the Iranian team tried to convey the pain that they had felt over 4 years, the economic pain, but also steadfastness, that they had a resistance economy, that in order for them to credibly get back into negotiations with the Americans, that they needed real guarantees from other international actors that they would have a mechanism to insulate Iran from a change in the American administration. In regard to proxies, it was interesting how it played out in the game, because the types of actions that the Iran team took using proxies were proxies that would be more amenable in real life. So in the Houthis, for all intents and purposes, have fire control over hundreds of kilometers southwest Saudi Arabia. So it was a natural play when the Saudis attacked their oil installations. And when it came to responding to U.S. interdictions, they had certain direct IRGC-backed Iraqi groups that are already primed to do something against Americans anyways. So they played those cards rather than, say, play in the card of Lebanese Hezbollah, which is important and also much more vulnerable.
Yeah, and maybe just to add one point as the control team on, we were as the control team the one who was then, if the Iran team would tell us we want this proxy group to do that, we as the control team were judging how likely that was to happen or what the impact of that would be. And so we were also then able to, there's difference, depending on how close the Iranian proxy is, you get a different kind of result. But
yeah, one quick point on the sort of the Iran question about whether or not they wanted to wait after the elections. I also recall too, I think at the end of the day, they didn't have to make that choice because their position was, we're only going to talk to you if you're willing to give us reparations and give us more than we actually received under the original JCPOA. So that sort of that position allowed them to sort of put that choice off. On the question of Saudi Arabia and enrichment and how does that factor into a future deal, I think part of Saudi's calculus on that is, the threat that emanates from Iran's program, right? And so I think, to the degree that Iran maintains an enrichment capability, I think that's going to be, and the level of its nuclear capability, I think that will be a factor going forward in Saudi's decision making on that. I don't think it's the only factor. And I think, this is something that, the United States would probably want to keep those discussions separate, right? There's the managing the Iranian nuclear threat, and then there's the discussions about Saudi's nuclear aspirations and its own program.
Liz, final word.
About the escalating, was the U.S. disinterested in escalating because of a broader interest in not getting entangled in a broader conflict around the world? Absolutely. I think we didn't spell it out for them, nor did they explicitly articulate it as a broad approach towards retrenching at home or keeping U.S. forces, a troop dial down of U.S. military or force posture outside of the United States. It wasn't explicit, but it was definitely part of what informed a disinterest in all-out war and active war. And not having the political support for that being part of President Trump's campaign policies and a continual disposition. And one interesting thing to take away from that is because we were trying in the escalatory scenario to test whether there would be a sensitivity to oil market effects in the conduct of U.S. policy. And it did seem to me like this broader political sentiment not seeking to have the U.S. military get involved in a hot conflict internationally, that was the bigger factor. It was not so much a disinterest in elevating energy prices internationally that was causing the instinct towards managing escalation, which is actually a really important takeaway in this economic climate.
Great. Well, with that, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us and thank our panel for a great discussion. And I think we're the only thing now holding you back from your drinks. So
I don't think so. I don't know.
Actually, that's true. You know, which might have led to the slightly more aggressive tone of some of the answers, or maybe the happier ones, depending on how you roll. But thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.